Thank you everyone for joining us today. For now, I'm going to hand over to Abdullah to give us a recap, after which Dr. Ribenk will be introducing Dr. Judy Mann, our speaker for this afternoon. We're very excited to hear from as she speaks about impacting behavioral change. Over to you, Abdullah.
Merci, thank you Tara, and thank you Tony and Leslie and Judy. Merci mesdames et messieurs, bonsoir et bienvenue à cette session, nouvelle session de la série de la Convention d'Abidjan conduit, la série de webinaires que la Convention d'Abidjan conduit avec l'African Marine West Network et Sustainable Seas Trust pour aider les pays de la Convention d'Abidjan à se doter déjà d'un cadre régional de lutte contre la pollution plastique qui sera plus tard décliné en plan d'action au niveau national qui sera conduit donc au niveau de chacun des pays. Ce programme entre dans le cadre d'un programme qui est plus global, financé par l'Union européenne et le programme des Nations Unies pour l'environnement, qui s'appelle le programme ACP MEAs, ou si vous voulez en français, ACP, Accords multilatéraux pour l'environnement à la phase 3, qui consiste donc à aider les pays membres de l'association ou de l'organisation Afrique-Caraïbes-Pacifique à se doter de capacités nouvelles pour remplir leurs obligations internationales en matière d'environnement. La semaine dernière, nous avions reçu deux excellentes contributions qui venaient de Kirstine Gilardi et d'Ingrid. On nous a parlé de la façon dont, au niveau international, la coopération se conduisait pour lutter contre les filets fantômes, pour ce qui concernait l'intervention d'Ingrid, et de façon globale sur comment la science essayait de nous apporter les outils qui permettaient de prendre des décisions politiques. Dans les interventions, il était apparu qu'il y avait un gap, un trou au niveau des pays africains où la recherche méritait d'être renforcée. C'est un point qui a été noté. Je pense que les contributions ont été très enrichissantes et rendez-vous a été pris pour essayer de faire en sorte que ce gap-là soit rapidement rempli, soit comblé, plus exactement. Et aujourd'hui, nous allons recevoir Judy Mann qui va intervenir sur un aspect qui est extrêmement important, qui est celui de la communication et des changements comportementaux. Parce que, comme j'ai l'habitude de le dire, généralement, on discute de ces questions environnementales-là entre experts. On oublie qu'il y a un certain nombre de parties prenantes qui ne sont pas à des niveaux d'expertise pour comprendre les questions environnementales ou surtout océaniques, qui méritent d'être embarquées dans l'aventure si nous voulons des résultats probants, concrets. Et c'est le grand public. Pour atteindre le grand public, il faut qu'il y ait des intermédiaires qui permettent de transformer les connaissances techniques, scientifiques, les expertises en connaissances pour le grand public afin qu'on puisse obtenir ces changements de comportement et amener le grand public à participer à ce travail de changement de paradigme qui va nous conduire à faire face de façon efficace à toutes les problématiques environnementales, à tous les défis environnementaux qui se dressent sur nos chemins. Donc, je n'irai pas plus loin. Je vais rendre le micro à Tara et à Tony afin que Judy puisse nous présenter aujourd'hui ce qu'elle nous a préparé. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much indeed, Abdullah, for that. You've partially introduced Judy anyway, but for me, it's a great pleasure to introduce Judy. I've known her for quite a long time, longer than possibly I should say here, but and you've already seen the document on Judy. It says that she's passionate about marine conservation. Well, that's absolutely true. And she's focused her career on helping people to take care of the oceans. Well, she's not only done that, she's actually excelled at it. She's done this from the South African Association for Marine Biological Research, SAMBRA, in Durban, and she's been there for a couple of years. She was the Director of Education for 10 years. As I said, she's been in this position and in Durban since 1992, which is, as I say, a good few years back. She was Director of Education for 10 years at Ushaka SeaWorld, and the first woman executive officer basically Chief Executive Officer there at Samba. She's currently a conservation strategist of the association, and she holds a master's degree in theology, a bachelor's degree in business administration, and a PhD from the University of Queensland in Australia. And she's president-elect of the International Zoo Educators Association. But to me, what's really important is that Judy thinks about the issues. She's in fact becoming a thought leader. And because of this, and because the way she not only thinks about it, but she puts her ideas into practice and she does the research, she's actually a wonderful person for us to be able to listen to today. So Judy, a very warm welcome for us, and huge thanks to you for making yourself available this afternoon. So good luck. We hope it goes superbly. We know that the content's going to be magnificent. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Tony, for that introduction. It's always a bit worrying when you have an introduction like that. That there's a lot to live up to. So I will do my best to share ideas. And I think that given the fact that we've got a nice smallish group today, I'm going to keep it pretty informal, and hopefully we'll have time for some questions at the end. So I think that I'm going to start with sharing my screen, and we should be good to go. Okay, what can everybody see? Can you see my screen and just the screen?
Yes, Judy, we can see it.
Okay, that's great. So my title is Building Capacity for Action, Education, Behavior Change, and Beyond. And I'm really going to focus today on that and beyond stage. So we're going to look very little at education. We're going to look a lot at behavior change and where we can go with our work. So all of us here are involved in the waste problem. We're here because somehow we care about marine waste. We're worrying about marine waste, and we're trying to solve the problem of marine waste. How can we get this off the beach? How can we get it out of the ocean? How can we prevent it from getting there in the first place? So is this the problem? Or is this the problem? Are we dealing with a lack of facilities? Are we dealing with the problem of infrastructure? Opportunities to reuse waste? Is it a production problem? Is it the use of too much? What really is the problem? Perhaps this is the problem. It's the lack of policies. Perhaps we've got a problem with not enough laws. Perhaps we've got a problem with the enforcement. Maybe too many cleanups and not enough prevention. I would say that all of those are a problem indeed. If I look back over the presentations that you've had in this series, all of them are dealing with different aspects of the waste in the marine environment situation. So we've covered all of those things, and all of those are indeed problems. But I would like to suggest that at the core of each of those issues is a person. It could be a busy mom running from A to B. It could be a government official. It could be a business owner, an entrepreneur. It could be a citizen of a city or a citizen of a slum. So at the core of all of our work on waste is actually a person, a human being. So I'd like to introduce you to my research species. I started off studying fish, and fish are fascinating. But I realized that it didn't really matter how much I studied fish. Unless I understood people, I wouldn't be able to protect the fish that I love so much. So this is my research species, because I decided I needed to start learning more about people. So humans, name Homo sapiens, distribution, we're pretty global. Our habitat is mostly terrestrial, except for the odd Sylvia Earle and people like that. Our diet is pretty omnivorous. We eat most things. No known predators. We are sexual reproduction, definitely, and we're one of the few species that has procreation simply for fun. Our reproductive rate could probably be described as exponential. And I think that if it comes to our behavior, the only way we can say is it really is irrational. So this is the species that we're going to be looking at today. I work in the waste industry. We have worked really hard to understand waste. all of those issues that I've raised up before. We've worked hard and we've got some brilliant, brilliant people working on it. But I think that we haven't invested enough time in understanding the human dimensions of waste. What makes people do what they do? And how can we effectively support the behaviors that we know are necessary to reduce waste in the marine environment? Now more than ever before, it's essential for us to understand human behavior, because that's ultimately where we're going to make the changes that we need to make. So we need to understand people much better. But before we go on to that, let's talk a little bit about behavior. Now, I'm sure amongst all of you, there must be at least one of you who's tried to lose weight. Anyone amongst you who's tried to stop smoking? Anyone who's tried to perhaps reduce your consumption of alcohol? When you tried to go about these changes in your behavior, what did you experience? Think back. Was it easy? Was it difficult? I think that all of us know that change is not easy. It's difficult to change habits. Change can be painful. You're throwing out perhaps something you've done all your life. Change means facing habits, especially when it's something like smoking or drinking. And change is easier if everyone does it. How many of you said, right, I'm going to go running with a friend? And that does make it easier. So change is not easy, but it can be done. The earliest studies on behavior change actually came from the health sector. And just think about all the lifestyle and behavior changes that we've seen in the last 50 years. We've seen a dramatic change in cigarette consumption. We've seen changes in use of suntan lotion. We've seen changes in alcohol use, in obesity. And all of that is because the health profession needed to change human behavior. So they started studying human behavior change. They put the human at the core of their behavior change campaigns, and they've managed to succeed a lot. In some cases, the change came about because of what we heard. And in other cases, for example, particularly with smoking, it came about when people started to see the impact of smoking on their own health, and then they started to change their behavior. But ultimately, we've learned a lot from the behavior change work done in the health business. And that's what I'd like to now go on to introduce you to some of the behavior change theories and a little bit of a look at how we can apply that in the marine waste environment. For a long, long time, we have thought that by educating people, we would be able to change their behavior. If only they knew more, and if only they cared more, then they would change their behavior. So we've produced educational booklets and guidelines. We've created websites and brochures and signage and Facebook pages. But unfortunately, we've realized that knowledge does not change behavior. If knowledge changed behavior, there would be absolutely no smokers. So knowledge alone is not enough to change behavior. But why is this? It's because behavior is incredibly complex, and knowledge is only one of the barriers to changing behavior. In fact, research suggests that at least 80% of the factors that influence pro-environmental behavior do not stem from knowledge or awareness. They stem from all these other things. They stem from motivation. They stem from the ability to make. They stem from experiences. They stem from the opportunity to think, different motivations, whether people feel that they have enough control to make a difference. This is a summary of what I did my PhD on, which is trying to understand environmental learning at our aquarium. And what I found is that people really are complex, and that changing behavior is not easy, but there are certain lessons that we've learned which can help us to change behavior so that ultimately we can look after the environment that we all care so much about. So, knowledge attitudes are not the only thing that is going to change behavior, but often it's a prerequisite. So I'm not saying that changing attitudes and increasing knowledge is not important. What I'm saying that it is only one component of our behavior change campaigns. Now, something that I've taken a long time to realize, and when I did my research, it really came home to me, is that we all wear invisible lenses. Each of us sees the world through our own eyes, based on our culture, our upbringing, based on our values. We see the world in one way. People see the world through their own lenses. Everyone sees the world differently. And one of the problems that we have is that we design brochures and signage based on who we are. And we design them for people who might be very different to ourselves. And this is one of the important things for us to realize, is that not everyone thinks the way we do. We need to start understanding our audience a lot better if we're going to reach them more effectively. Now, when I show you this slide, you're thinking, what on earth has this got to do with us? But who's really got this concept right? Marketers. Who's really good at getting us to do stuff that we might not really want to do? How many of us have perhaps bought that face cream in the hope that we'll instantly look younger? Marketers have really got this communicating message and behavior incentives right. What's interesting, though, for them is that if they produce an advert and people don't buy their product, they don't get cross and say, those stupid people, they clearly don't know what they're missing. What they do is they go back to the drawing board and they say, how can we redesign our advert so that people do buy our product? That's unlike ourselves. And when we design a brochure that's really, really good and people don't do what the brochure says they should do, we get grumpy with them. Maybe we need to start looking at ourselves first and understanding why we're getting it wrong so that we can improve it in future. So how can all of this help us in the marine waste environment? I'm going to very quickly recap. Community-based social marketing was put together by Doug Mackenzie Moore, and it's been used in many, many different environments to really help people reduce or to change their behavior with an emphasis on the environment or on human health. And really, the aim is to use marketing to help promote socially acceptable behavior. It's called community-based social marketing because research has shown that at the heart of all of our changes in behavior is really a community. And I think that that's what I'd like to ask everyone to think about. Which community are you working with? And what are the characteristics of that community? So often when we design a communication campaign, we try to look at something for the general public. The general public is made up of many, many different communities. Which community do you want to work with, and which community's behavior are you trying to change? Because community is really, really critical because each community is different. And interestingly, what we've also found is that personal interaction with members of our community is often one of the best drivers of change. It's not all the brochures and things that we use, it's actually personal one-on-one interaction. Another behavior change theory is really important, and that's the concept of social norms. We're essentially social creatures, and we're very influenced by what we see other people doing. And this is the essence of social norms. Social norms are those unwritten rules of what's acceptable in a society. They're the informal understandings that govern our behavior. If you get into a lift and you suddenly turn and face the people will feel a bit uncomfortable because our social norm says turn and face the door. In the past, the social norm was generally to shake hands. Now, people are thinking twice about shaking hands with COVID. And if you think about social norms, the rapidity with which we've quickly adapted to wearing masks, we've gone from very few people wearing masks to masks being now a real social norm. So COVID has given us an incredible example of the changes in behavior that can happen if the incentives are there and they're good enough. Another important thing to think about is what's called diffusion of innovation. And this is really the rate that an idea spreads through a community, and it spreads at different rates. We've got those innovators who are the ones who are wearing a mask long before the government tells us to, the early adopters, the early majority, few more people, then the people who say, oh, well, if I have to wear a mask or if it's legislated, I'll wear it. And then we get those laggards who are going to really try and resist as much as they can. So any idea that we're trying to spread in a community is going to go through this diffusion of innovation until everybody is doing it. And then there's something that I find really difficult, and that's the intention action gap. And there's a lot of research on this, and all of us know that. We've all perhaps wanted to go for a run, but oh, in the evening, you get home from work, you're tired, that couch just looks a whole lot better. I know that I should use my metal straws. I've got them in my handbag, I've got them in the cupboard, but sometimes I just pop out and I'm just going to have a milkshake and I haven't found it, or I forgot to bring it with me. Often I don't do what I know I think I should do. So there is an intention action gap that has been well studied. So people might know what they should do. They might really want to do it, but sometimes it's just difficult to actually do it. And that's what we've got to work on overcoming. I want us to look at this little slideshow. This is a very simple way of talking about changing behavior. We can get the little people on the left and we can get them all enthusiastic and we can tell them about our programs and we can tell them what we want them to do. And they move up to this peak of good intentions. They're excited and they're ready to do what we want them to do. But then habits and barriers take us down into that pit of apathy. We really wanted to recycle, but oh my goodness, it was a bit difficult and we didn't have the things and barriers all got in the way. So our job is to build a bridge of support and to help people go from that peak of good intentions where we're trying to change the behavior all the way over onto the other side, which I've called our waste-free ocean. How can we help to support people in changing their behavior to achieve what we're trying to achieve? These are the 5 steps that I'd like to go through with you. The first is, whose behavior am I working on? Whose behavior do I want to change? Do I really understand that target community? And how well do I understand them? And then the next one is really difficult. What do I want them to do or to change? And here often we give big examples of what we want to do. We need to think very specifically about what changes we're looking for. What's stopping them? And how can we identify and remove those barriers? So what's stopping them doing what we want them to do? What are the benefits of the behaviors to them? Why should they do what you want them to do? Then we look at ways to support that behavior and communicate it. And then finally, measuring the impact. As I go through this, I'd like each of you to think of a specific example that you might have. You might want to be working with a school group. You might want to be working with someone in industry. You might be wanting to work with a local community. How can you apply these 5 steps to your individual situations? So the first thing is, who are you communicating with? What we've said is that you need to identify your audience very clearly. Each of these different audiences has very different demographics. They've got different psychographics, which are their attitudes, their knowledge, their values, their belief. They've got different capacities to change. And each one is facing different barriers and different benefits to the behaviors that we want them to do. So we need to really start by understanding who are we communicating with. And I know that a lot of the work that Linda Godfrey's done has been to really understand the people that we're working with and what it is that makes them tick, so that we can communicate more effectively with them. So each of these communities that I've got I've got photos of here, would have different characteristics and would need a different approach. The next thing we need to look at is, what do we want them to do? Do we want them to do something that's once off? For example, an example that we use is planting indigenous trees. It's not something that you're going to do day after day. It's a once-off behavior. Or something like not littering could be a repeat behavior. So what is it that we really want people to do, and how often do we expect them to do it? And then it's important to understand that recycling, if going to use that as an example, is not a behavior. Recycling is a whole chain of behaviors. If you want somebody to engage in recycling, for example, firstly, they have to decide they want to recycle. So they have to have an intent. Then they need to research the options. So where can I recycle? What can be recycled? Where will I take my recycling? What will happen to it then? Then I've got to go off and buy my recycling containers, perhaps. Then I've got to tell the family, and I've got to tell them again and again and again, because I know with my particular family, I often get a situation where someone comes to me and says, what must I do with this? Which one does it go into? So it's training the family. And then it's remembering to do it. It's remembering to do the recycling from the bathrooms as well as just the kitchen. So you've got to keep remembering to do it. Then, if you're lucky enough to have a car, when the recycling gets to such a buildup in your back room or wherever it is that your husband starts getting grumpy with you, which is what happens on our side, I've got to put it all in the car, I've got to drive to the recycle station, I've got to offload it, come back and start the whole process again. And at every step in this behavior chain is a potential barrier, a potential reason for me not to complete the behavior. Think about the behaviors that you're trying to work with. Where are the barriers? What is the chain? Have you broken down those behaviors, those things that you want people to do, into all of these different steps so that you can actually find out where the barriers are, what's stopping them from doing it? Ultimately, when you get all of that right, you get a system like ours, which is 3 different bins, 1 for plastic, 1 for tin, and 1 for glass, and then that great build-up that I spoke about. But generally, it works quite well. But then even we have relapses over and again. We have that intention behavior gap. But really the essence here is break down the behaviors into all the components so that you can see and understand where the barriers are. Because then, once you've identified the barriers, you want to try and remove them. So in this whole series, you've discussed lots and lots of barriers. You've discussed the waste removal, we've discussed waste reduction, you've discussed lots of things. But let's have a look at it in the context of people. Is a barrier knowledge? As I said earlier, knowledge is not the only prerequisite to changing behavior, but it is a prerequisite. So how can we supply people with knowledge and information that they can actually use? If you want people to use recycled bottles, are there facilities available for them to fill their bottles? Are we providing people with easy access to recyclable bags? Is it easy to put your waste into a recycle box? Is finance a barrier? Perhaps it's a cost issue. One of the examples might be here for nylon on the beach, is providing people with those poles, the little receptacles for waste nylon, and that seems to have worked quite well. So what's stopping people doing what you want them to do? What are the barriers, and how can you remove those barriers? The barriers might be infrastructure. There just aren't opportunities to recycle or to have waste disposal. The barriers might be something to do with legislation. And sometimes the barriers, it's just too complicated. Trying for me even to understand all those different plastic rules and regulations and what can be recycled and what can't and what can be mixed with what's, often people just throw their hands up and say, it's too difficult. I've got too many other priorities. How can we make it simple for them? How can we remove the barriers and make it easy for them to recycle or to do whatever it is the behavior that you've got in mind? And then the next thing is identifying the benefits. And these might be intrinsic or they might be extrinsic benefits. So a benefit might be money. That's an extrinsic benefit. People get paid to do something that you want them to do. That's definitely a benefit. But the benefit might actually be feeling good. This is an example from Hondeklip Bay, where they did a presentation on the impact of cigarette butts in the area to the fishermen. And when they came back, this is a WWF project a few months later, the fishermen proudly showed them how now they're putting all of their cigarette butts into a container and bringing them back to shore instead of just chucking them overboard. The fishermen are not getting anything out of it except the feeling that they're doing something right. And sometimes that intrinsic benefit is very, very powerful. The next thing we need to do is we need to start communicating the norm. Often what happens is that if one person does it, it's a bit strange. If more than one person does it, it's okay. We need to get to the point where most people are doing the right thing, and it becomes that social norm that I spoke about earlier. It becomes something that's standard that people do. So the theory of social norms suggests that if we want to change behavior, we need to make it normal. People need to see that this is something that everybody does. And we need to try and communicate that norm as something that's just the way it is, so that then the person chucking their litter out the car is seen as different. The person not wearing a mask is seen as different. We need to try and communicate that norm. Something that's been quite powerful in many of the behavior change campaigns I've worked on is using influencers and early adopters. These are people who other people listen to. These are the people who say, yes, I am going to start that particular program, or I'm going to communicate about it. I'm going to use metal straws, for an example. I'm going to use a recyclable shopping bag, etc. So can you find a storyteller? Can you find somebody, maybe a movie star, maybe a sportsman in your community? And it doesn't have to be somebody famous. It just needs to be somebody that your community looks up to. And can you use them in your campaign and to leverage their ability to communicate with different people? And then show and celebrate people doing it right. So often we talk about waste by showing a photo of waste. Instead of trying to show people doing it right, we often show people doing it wrong. And in that way, we're actually reinforcing the wrong behavior. So let's show people doing it right and try and enforce that positive behavior as opposed to reinforcing the negative behavior. And then also giving people feedback. If people are doing it right and you're starting to see results, share that with them. People thrive on feedback. It makes them feel good. It makes them feel that it's actually worthwhile. And it's a really important incentive to keeping behaviors changed and going. And then making the behavior popular and socially acceptable to do. So I've got two photos here. The one I took in Pretoria and the other one I took actually in West Africa. And you can see the difference. On the right, on the left-hand side, the place looks a mess. So if I drop my litter here, it's fine because it's actually not going to make much difference and no one's going to notice. With the little village on the right, you can see how clean and neat and tidy it is. So if somebody starts dropping their rubbish there, it's going to be really noticed. So making the behavior popular and socially acceptable and making the other behavior unacceptable is an important motivator and something that we need to think creatively about how we can do it. And then my favorite one is measuring the impact. This is a critical aspect of any campaign that we might run. Before we start, we need to work out how are we going to measure if we've actually achieved our results. We have far too much to do to be able to waste time on things that don't work. We need to know what works and we need to be able to share and communicate what works with other people so that we can speed this process up. We've got so many urgent problems facing us that we can't afford to waste time getting it wrong and then letting somebody else get it wrong for the same reasons. So before we start, we need to work out what are we trying to achieve? What are our baselines? How will we know that we've actually reached our goals? What indicators are we going to use to measure it? And then how will we measure those indicators? This evaluation is really, really hard. And it's something that we always forget, but it's really, really important. I often say is that if we don't know where we're going, any route will get us there. We need to know where we're going so that we can reach our goals. This is just an example from Uganda. This is a little village outside Entebbe, and I want you to look at how amazingly clean this little village is. The Ugandan Wildlife Education Authority decided that they were going to work with a couple of villages, and they were going to sort out the waste problem. They used community-based social marketing across the program. They identified the key communities they were going to work with. They chose two. They identified the main problems, and there were two big problems. The one was organic waste, and the other was plastic waste. They worked with the community to find out what was stopping people collecting the plastic bottles, what was causing people to chuck their organic waste away and not use it. So they tried to identify the behaviors and the barriers. Then they started to look at what benefits people could get if they managed to change these behaviors. They've got a big program making charcoal from the organic waste, and you can see two ladies there that are making the charcoal. This has become quite a popular home industry, and there are multiple people making charcoal in this village, and you don't see any organic waste on the side of the road. They've got a big recycling program running, and local women are making money out of the program. So they've been able to clean up their villages. They've got an incredible sense of pride in their villages because they've used community-based social marketing principles. They've addressed the barriers, they've found the benefits, and they're able to change the behavior. And it's quite interesting, as you drive from Entebbe onwards, you can actually see the villages that have been part of this program and those that haven't by the amount of litter and dirt on either side of the road. So let's summarize again, thinking again of your particular issue. Who am I talking to? What are the characteristics of the community I want to work with? What do I want them to do? Do I really, really understand the behavior that I want to change? What's stopping them? Do I know what the barriers are and can I remove them? What are the benefits for them? How can we support the behavior? How can we communicate the norm? And how am I going to measure it? I think that we are faced with a series of great opportunities that are brilliantly disguised as insurmountable problems. We are all passionate, we are all enthusiastic about what we do. And I truly believe that by understanding people and working more effectively with people, we will be able to resolve these insurmountable problems. And there are opportunities to really make a difference. And then my last slide just says, you are not alone. So often when we're trying to do stuff wherever we are around the world, we think that we're facing these problems alone. We're not alone. There are many, many people who are facing the same challenges. We've made the same mistakes and we're going to make them again. But really, working together, we will make a difference. So please, I'm happy to answer questions now. And then if there are any questions that you'd like to email to me, my email address is there. Thank you very much, everybody. Sorry about the technical glitch in the middle, but hopefully it wasn't for too long. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy. That was wonderful to hear. Everyone, please feel free to send through your questions in the Q&A box or in the chat. Thank you again, Judy, and that it wasn't it wasn't too long of a technical glitch. In the meantime, I was wondering if you can comment at all. I really appreciate what you said about how sometimes it isn't always sort of a simple solution, even if we know the right thing we should be doing. Recycling, for example, can be a lot more complicated than we're led to believe. I was wondering if you can comment at all about how to encourage people to make the right decisions, then how we can influence the right kind of norms. For example, not changing to a sort of marketed good environmental decision that actually ends up being worse, for example.
Okay, I think that the most important thing is to really do your research first. And I think that that's where we often jump into a campaign. We jump into doing things without taking a step back and asking ourselves, why do we want to do this? And what is going to be the outcome? I've facilitated a number of workshops where we've looked at changing behavior. And we have often actually got stuck at the what behavior can we change? We often set ourselves goals that are actually completely unachievable. And I think that it's setting ourselves realistic goals and making sure that we can work towards those realistic goals by breaking them down. So it's very complex, but I think that it's taking a step back before we move forward. Because so often we rush into doing things without thinking through very carefully what it is we're trying to achieve. So that would be my first thing, is take a step backwards first before we move forwards.
Thank you, Judy. I see there have been a few questions that have come through here. The first one says, how do you define and determine the most appropriate benefits?
That's often one of the most difficult things to do. And the only way to do it is to really talk to the community. So find out from them what would be a benefit. And often, as I say, the benefits are either intrinsic or extrinsic. So extrinsic is they get money out of it, they get a product out of it, they're swapping waste for food or for something like that. And often the benefit is intrinsic. It's a feeling that you're doing something right. Sometimes the benefit is actually public acknowledgement. So we've used pledges, which is our visitors make a promise, and that promise is a public promise. And that's often an important benefit. So people want to keep their promises. So that's another motivator. So it's really getting to understand the particular situation you're in and then using that to identify the benefits. Often we will be unaware of what the benefits could be until you start to talk to people.
Thank you, Judy. There's another question that says here, I thought a paper titled, if all we do are beach cleanups, then all we will ever do are beach cleanups, suggested we shouldn't be cleaning the beaches. Would you agree?
I would disagree. So I would say that beach cleanups are important for a number of reasons. Firstly, they do remove waste from the beach. Secondly, they are incredibly valuable opportunities to communicate and to raise awareness about issues, but they're not enough. So I think that we can use beach cleanups, and I think we should still continue to do them, but they can't work in isolation. We've got to work all the way up from the beach, through the rivers, etc., and we need to work all the way back. So I think beach cleanups can often be seen as a bit of a band-aid, and they make us feel good. And I still think that they have a role to play, but I think we have to go a lot further than that. And also empowering the people who come for those beach cleanups so that they can see that ultimately they are making a difference. Because the problem with beach cleanups is that it works really, really well for the first few times, but people don't want to keep doing it again and again and again unless they start seeing changes moving further up the line. So we need to use them as perhaps publicity, we can use them for awareness, but they're certainly not the only thing that we should be doing.
Thank you, Judy. There's a comment here that says, agree, Judy, the species called Homo sapiens has a lot of pride and appreciation for our environment. Can you comment on the prevalence of beach cleanups and them possibly issuing the message that the problem is that it's sort of mostly related to the beach and it doesn't originate on land?
I think it depends on where you are. So in some areas, a lot of the litter and the waste on a beach is actually land derived, and in others it might be derived from marine waste, so from boats, fishing vessels, etc., etc. I think it really depends on where you are. I think that what I would recommend for beach cleanups is a time of reflection. And I think that so often during a beach cleanup, we're busy. We're busy doing. We don't actually take a step back to look at what we're collecting and think about its journey, and then reflect back on our role in that particular product's journey. I think that so often it's easy for us to blame them when we're doing a beach cleanup. We always blame them, they're not doing it right. But for us to take a step back and, as I said, put on those glasses, so put on those lenses and try and look at things through other people's eyes. And I think that that's part of building the type of empathy that we need that can actually go further than a beach cleanup, that can start to lobby for better waste management in informal areas, etc., etc. So I think that during a beach cleanup, it would be really valuable to have a little bit of moment for reflection and to think about where this waste comes from and why it's there, what's our role in it, and how can we make sure that it doesn't get there again. So I think that our research has shown that reflection is one of the better predictors of change, giving people a chance to think. And maybe that's something we can build into our beach cleanups, is a bit of a quiet time to actually think and reflect.
Thank you, Judy. And that's a great point, particularly, you know, in cases when you're at the beach and it's a good location then for reflecting. There's a comment here in the chat that says, what is the best way to harness the power of the media to influence behavioral change?
Okay, that's a great question. And I think that we have many opportunities now to harness the media. one of the points that I raised is the importance of sharing some positive news, sharing good news, because so often we just share bad news and people are starting to feel disempowered. One of the saddest papers I read a while ago is that environmentalists are now starting to attract negative people. So the people that are starting to study environmental sciences are intrinsically negative because they feel right at home amongst us, because we tend to be very, very negative. We need to start sharing some positive stories. We need to start sharing some hopeful stories. We need to empower people as opposed to just giving them the bad news. There is plenty of evidence of bad news. How can we show where it's going right? And how can we replicate what's going right? And I think the media plays a role with us on that. They can help us to share those positive stories and to communicate what is working. And then also really importantly, making sure the media shares the right facts. I think that we've got into this world of half facts, no facts, true facts, false facts, etc. We need to start looking at making sure that whatever we share with the media is entirely accurate and that they get it right too, and hold the media to account for what they actually produce.
Thank you, Judy. There's some wonderful suggestions there. I like what you mentioned earlier about having empathy, because often we might skip to judgments about why a certain area is littered, but if the community doesn't have sort of refuse removal or services in place, it's slightly more understandable that they don't have a lot of other alternatives. In terms of education, can you offer any insights on how to sort of effectively communicate that and come across sincerely and not sort of condescending, or to effectively communicate and educate with communities?
Working with communities, the best is to work with community leaders. So I think that in any community, it's working with the leaders in those particular communities, helping to understand their challenges. And the best advocates we have are people within the communities. Communities want to change. They don't want to live in an area that looks the way many communities do. They often want to change, and that Ugandan example was a good one. But it's also getting the systems in place to support them. We've had many marine waste network meetings in KZN where we've discussed the lack of service delivery, the lack of waste removal. So we need to be able to support those communities. So we need the champions within the communities, and those are the best communicators within a community are champions. As I said right at the beginning, in community-based social marketing, often the best communicators are individuals on the ground. It's person-to-person communication. It's not mass media. It really is one-on-one, and that's often the best way to change on the ground. But we do need the systems in place. So governments need to be held to account. Local governments, national governments need to be held to account to do what they're supposed to do. Otherwise, we're going to have a long-term challenges. Communities are not going to be able to do it forever on their own.
Thank you, Judy. Can you offer any sort of advice on how to, as you mentioned, hold sort of different people accountable from the media to sort of local government, how one can hold them accountable without sort of alienating them or ruffling feathers and things like that?
What a lovely question. It's a really hard one. I've just seen from our KZN situation, holding government to account is not easy, but I think that it's something that we have to do. I think that alienating and ruffling feathers is sometimes necessary if we're going to achieve what we need to achieve. We're dealing with a problem that's got so many levels to it. So it's got financial levels, it's got political overtones, it's got capacity issues, and we have to work across the board. It's not easy. But naming and shaming, I wouldn't go that far because I don't think that's effective. I think it's far better to have people around the table. So I would only look at alienation and ruffling feathers as a very last resort. So really keeping people around the table and trying to hold them to account, keep explaining what needs to happen. I think we just have to keep going. Sometimes I do feel like giving up, but I think we just have to keep trying.
Thank you, Judy. There's another question here that relates to what you mentioned earlier. They say, thank you for the presentation. If the community is not connected to large-scale communication means like social media, what communication strategy would you use to target them? Would that relate to your earlier answer?
Yeah, I think that that's actually sometimes an easier situation, because then you are working one-on-one with the community. I think that working with the UIC example, working through churches, working through the religious groups, working through positive, enthusiastic school groups, teachers, community leaders, is often far more effective than any form of social media campaign. So working with those few people first, getting them on board, getting them supportive, and then working through that into the community. And in the Ugandan example, the religious groups and religious leaders were really important.
Thanks, Judy. There's another question in the chat here that says, behavioral change also requires education of the youngest children. What is the ideal age or grade level to introduce children to environmental education programs?
So that's a lovely question. And I think that we've been through quite an interesting phase with environmental education. To me, the most important thing is taking kids out into nature. And a lovely quote I heard a little while ago is, teach children to love nature before you ask them to save it. So let children get out into nature, let them enjoy it, let them experience it, and let them love it before you ask them to save it. And that can start at the earliest age. There's another popular saying, no bad news before about 7 years old, maybe 6 years old. If we give children too much bad news about the environment before they can actually cognitively process it, we're actually doing more harm than good. So to start off with little young children, share the joy, share the hope, share the love that you have for the environment. And then as they get older, when they can process the bad news, then we can start talking about saving the environment. But don't bring that in too early. We've got some amazing young ambassadors for the environment that can process information very quickly, but lots of kids can't. So let children love nature first, and then ask them to care for it and save it.
On that note, Judy, can you give any sort of suggestions about later grades and ages, and how you would sort of emphasize the positive when there's so much negative about in the media, and even sort of a beach cleanup does have a bit of a negative connotation to get you there? Can you give any suggestions for that?
The suggestions for that would be making sure that you bookend your message. So you start off with something positive, you go into the problem that if you're wanting to address, and then ending off with empowering what can be done, so that you've bookended that message. You've got a bit of love and inspiration, you've got the problem, so you actually address the issue, you explain what can be done, what people are doing, what them as a young person can do, and then you end off with something positive again, so that they're not left with a feeling of hopelessness or despair. And sometimes the problems are difficult, and sometimes there are no easy solutions, but kids need to understand that we're working on them, and that this isn't a negative, and it's not a forever bad situation, that we are working towards solving these problems, and hopefully empowering them to become part of that solution.
Thank you so much, Judy. So on that note, would you sort of tailor marine education almost to younger ages, to get them to have an appreciation for the environment before introducing sort of plastic pollution and things like that at a later age?
It depends very much on the programs that you're running. So I would definitely start off with positive, sharing love, sharing hope messages with younger kids, and then building onto it. But it also depends a lot on if you've done a lot of time in the environment with a group, and there are maybe 7, 8 years old, you can bring in the plastic pollution. Bring it in naturally. They're probably going to find something on the beach anyway, so bring it in then. So make it a natural part of the story. Don't start the story with this is a waste problem. We start the story with the environment and with love. We build in the waste along the way, as opposed to having a lesson just on recycling or just on waste problems. Try and build it into something that's more than just the waste issue.
Thank you so much, Judy. I don't see any more questions here in the Q&A box or in the chat, but if anyone else would like to submit questions at a later stage, we will happily forward those on to Judy after this. There's another comment that says, given that people are more concerned about themselves than they are about the environment, could one play to that they love the environment and to them it is the loss to them that they would it would be a loss to them that they would be the issue and not the problems of the environment. I think that's relating to how the environment will affect them personally, rather than just for the sake of loving the environment.
I think that whole concept of ecosystem benefits and what we're actually standing to lose with the current situation in the environment is certainly coming through, and it's coming back with different motivators. So some people are motivated to care for the environment's sake. Most people are motivated to care for the environment because of what it gives them. So I think that it's, again, coming back to understanding your audience. What is it that motivates them? What is their value system? There's a huge amount of research on values. So what is it that's going to work for your particular audience? And people are motivated by different things. So it's understanding that.
Thank you so much, Judy. I think you've been almost a breath of fresh air in terms of all the positivity that comes with behavioral change and education, and not just sort of preaching the dangers of plastic pollution, which are of course very relevant. But it's great to hear your take on this. I don't see any questions remaining, but I think we can happily pass those on to you. So if anyone has any questions after this webinar or watching the recording, you're welcome to email either us at webinars@sctafrica.org.za, and we can pass those along to Judy. In the meantime, I'd just like to say thank you so much, Judy, for presenting for us today. It's really, really great to hear your insights, and I think you give us a lot of food for thought. There's some comments coming through that say many thanks, Judy. Brilliant. I'm not sure if anyone else would like to give any closing remarks, but on behalf of SST and the Abidjan Convention, thank you so much. We will have 2 more sessions taking place next week on Tuesday and on Thursday. On Tuesday, we will be hearing from someone from the South African Local Government Association, SALGA, about the importance of municipalities and how we can use them to stop the spread of waste into the oceans. And then on Thursday, we will be hearing from someone from WWF. In the meantime, I think we can end the session here for today. Would anyone else like to give any closing comments? Tony, Abdullah?
Judy, I just want to say huge thanks to you, and I totally echo Heg's comment. It was brilliant, really refreshing, which is what Tara also said. Really, really lovely, just what we required. And I totally agree with you. I don't often agree with you, but on this occasion I do. So well done, and thank you very much from SST. I see Abdullah is coming up.
Merci Tony. Thank you Judy. C'était fascinant. Moi, je suis personnellement très attaché à ces questions de changements comportementaux. D'abord, à la Convention d'Abidjan, je pilote la communication, les partenariats. Je sais que tout le travail que nous pouvons environnementales, nous pouvons accumuler toutes les expertises que nous voulons. Nous pouvons faire toutes les législations que nous voulons, tous les textes que nous voulons. Mais si nous n'avons pas de contact réel sur les populations, sur le grand public, pour les conduire à changer d'attitude, c'est comme si on essayait de vider l'océan avec nos seuls bras. Ça ne va pas marcher. J'ai vu dans votre présentation, vous avez expliqué les difficultés qu'il y avait parfois quand on cherche à améliorer des choses, à modifier toutes les oppositions, toutes les adversités que nous pouvons avoir sur le chemin, tous les défis qu'il peut y avoir à lever quand il y a des changements d'habitude. Moi, il me revient qu'une fois en Côte d'Ivoire, on était en réunion, j'expliquais pourquoi on pouvait envisager le tri sélectif. dans la zone de la Convention d'Abidjan. Ça faisait rire beaucoup de gens. Je venais d'arriver à Abidjan, j'ai même entendu quelqu'un dire « Laissez-lui un peu de temps, il vient d'arriver ». Parce que je venais de France, effectivement, où je suis d'ailleurs actuellement avec ma famille. Or, moi, j'ai vu en France quand on a commencé à adopter le tri sélectif. Ce n'était pas évident. Il y avait des résistances incroyables. Rebelles comme Français, il n'y en a pas deux. Les Français se sont opposés de façon générale au tri sélectif. Mais après, ça a marché. On s'y est habitué. Les populations ont commencé à faire le tri à l'intérieur des maisons même, avant de mettre les déchets à la déchetterie. D'autres pays ont imaginé d'autres solutions. On a vu ici durant ces webinaires-là, les présentations, il y a des pays qui donnaient de l'argent contre du plastique sous forme de déchets. Ce sont des solutions qui peuvent être envisagées, comme quelqu'un l'a dit, et comme vous-même, Judy, vous l'avez dit dans votre présentation, soit, mais vous avez plus insisté sur la carotte, c'est-à-dire donc inciter, baser le discours sur les choses positives, sur l'amour. D'autres vont peut-être dire que oui, il faut qu'il y ait aussi de la sanction un peu. Il faut que dans les législations, il y ait des mesures punitives qui vont accompagner la carotte, les mesures d'incitation. En tout cas, on a beaucoup appris de votre présentation et nous espérons que le document qui va être présenté plus tard, qui va être tiré de ces présentations-là pour doter les pays de la Convention d'Abidjan d'un cadre régional de lutte contre la pollution plastique, on pourra insérer en bonne place ces questions sur les changements comportementaux et sur la communication. Au nom de la Convention d'Abidjan, merci. Au nom de l'Union européenne et du Programme des Nations Unies pour l'environnement qui finance aussi ce programme ACP-MES3 que je coordonne. Je vous remercie. Au revoir.
Thank you so much, Abdullah and Tony. And again, thank you so much, Judy. It was really wonderful to hear your talk today. Definitely brilliant.